I'm delighted to welcome Leslie Huckfield. Leslie has been elected to both the House of Commons and to the European Parliament, and served in the Labour government at the end of the 1970s. More recently, he was the director of Social Enterprise Network Scotland, and teaches at Glasgow Caledonian University. Towards the end of last year, he published a book called How Blair Killed the Coops, Reclaiming Social Enterprise from its Neoliberal Turn. And today he's going to be talking to us about the marketisation of the third sector in the UK and whether it can be stopped. I'll just remind you that if you're not Leslie, please do remember to turn your microphone off. Leslie will talk for 30 or so minutes, and then there'll be time for questions and so forth afterwards. So without further ado, whenever you're ready, please, Leslie. Thank you very much.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. I am forever starting off presentations like this by saying, can you see me and hear me okay? Right, well, just a big thank you to Andrew and to Patrick for my being here today. I'm obviously very grateful, and very grateful too for all of those who've been able to find the time to attend this afternoon, so thank you very much indeed. I hope that will include also Derek from Dublin City and Gerard from TUD in Dublin, but we'll see if they turn up a bit later. But because we're recording this, I'm hoping that this will be able to be distributed perhaps a bit more widely. Can I just start off by saying two things? First of all, I have a reputation, for those who know me, for including far too many slides in my presentations. But to put people's minds at rest, I don't talk to all of the slides. So in case you think I've got an hour and 15 minutes presentation, it isn't. I will only be actually using some of the slides. The other thing I want to say is that I try and make a big thing with my students, and it's the same with me, that everything we try and use in seminars like this needs to be research-based. In other words, it's not just my expressing my own personal opinion. It's my showing where I've got the stuff from. In other words, it's not just a critical presentation. It's a critical presentation in this particular case with 4 slides of references at the end. So in case I don't have time to go through all the slides, there is a copious referencing section at the end of the presentation. The other thing I want to say, and I need to make this a bit clear perhaps, this is in no way my sitting in Scotland and telling people in Ireland what to do. First of all, that's not my style. But secondly, politically, I would find great difficulty for anybody in Scotland, England or Wales trying to tell people in Ireland what to do. So it's not intended as that. Much more, it's intended as the sharing of experiences. As you will see in just a few minutes, I've been involved in third sector activity, would you believe, back from the, forwards from the 1960s. So I have got a bit of a background in stuff like this, and I just want to share my experiences with you. Okay, let's see, Andrew, if the screen share works. And again, I'll be asking you if you can see everything. Can everybody see all of that?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Right, okay. Let me get back to where I was actually going to start. Hold tight a minute. Right. I want to say two things. First of all, I'm obviously going to be talking about the marketisation of the third sector, but I also want to try and make several references to how we get more of this stuff in what I call mainstream public or political discourse. I'm still very politically active in my trade union and in third sector organisations, and it's unfortunately the case that a lot of the subjects that I want to raise this afternoon really don't enter into mainstream discourse very much. So I hope that we can share our thoughts a bit later during the discussion on how we might possibly do that. Okay, that's a naive, naked plug for my book, which actually summarises a lot of the things that I want to talk about. I can tell you later how to get hold of it, and Chapter 1 is actually available free now online from Manchester University Press, but it actually summarises a lot of the arguments that I want to try and make this afternoon. that's a bit of background about me, a very summary snapshot of my activities, would you believe, from 1968, because I was actually elected to the House of Commons in 1967, and I have been involved in a lot of political and third sector implementation since that time. I'm still a director of the Sheffield Cooperative Development Group. I finished as a director of SenScot, the Social Enterprise Network Scotland, in 2019 because we changed the governance arrangements, something, by the way, that I promoted. So it wasn't done against me, it was done because I wanted to see it. I want to give you a few openings to what I want to say. First of all, if I can present to you a paper by Matt Jensen at a Copenhagen Business School conference in March 2019, and I think what he says here is very relevant to the presentation this afternoon. Civil society has been mobilised to solve and provide social services, and governments in the West are increasingly shifting responsibility for public service delivery to civil society. I have to say that causes a lot of concern to people like me, because it's not just moving the delivery of public services out of the public sector into civil society, it's also trying to do it a lot cheaper. The difficulty with that approach was actually summarised by the British Council as long ago as 2014, when they said that if you want to get private investment involved in all of that, private investment will only get involved in the delivery of public services where the outputs that they can invest in are measurable. And the problem that we're going to see increasingly this afternoon is that a lot of the outputs that really matter in the delivery of public services aren't measurable. So they won't get the money, with the result that a lot of the really needy public services won't be delivered. The interesting thing to me is that a lot of the evidence is already appearing on the ground from Laura Beer's team at LSE, and from a conglomeration of universities based at the University of Lancaster on what community-based organisations have been doing during COVID. And that ethnographically based research done at a very, very local level is already showing that it's the very small community-based, community democratically controlled organisations, those are the ones that really make the difference. Not the big ones who can cope with the external private investment, but the smaller ones on the ground who are not sufficiently equipped to access that. But even if you believe in the concept of impact investment and attracting private investment for the delivery of public services, even if those outputs could be measured, as long ago as 2012, Michael Porter, that's Michael Porter of the Five Forces, Michael Porter's Monitor Consulting Group had a look at that concept of impact investment and came to the conclusion that in many cases it wasn't going to work. You didn't have enough investors that could understand it. You didn't have the infrastructure to deliver it. So there's a whole lot of people then, and I could give you some more examples, but I'll spare you the time this afternoon, of people and evidence on the ground, particularly since COVID, showing that impact investment doesn't really work on the ground. Let me give you a very, very quick thumbnail sketch of what's happened in England, and this is largely the area covered by my book between 1998 and 2002. In that first new Labour government period between 1997 and 1991, there were 1999 and 2001, there were two new Labour governments that rapidly, if you like, extracted themselves from the cooperative and mutual sector and got themselves into public service delivery using less well governed and less well democratically controlled social enterprises. That was a deliberate act of government policy, and all of that was shown. Well, it's shown in my book, but I can go through all of the examples of the way that that was done. In fact, we got to the stage where, when Peter Lloyd produced his consultancy recommendations for the Social Enterprise Coalition in 2003, the transfer of the delivery of public services into the hands of social enterprises was almost complete, and that's Peter simply producing the framework for that delivery. If you go to Jenny Carmel and Emma Harlock's article in 2008, the third sector as governable terrain, what they're actually saying is that the transfer of the third sector being harnessed into public service delivery is almost complete. So if you go back to 1997, first year of the new Labour government, and if you go to the Carmel and Harlock article about 10 years later, you will see that there has been a fairly significant transformation of third sector activity from locally controlled, locally democratically accountable organisations based in their communities to third sector organisations which have been transformed into business-minded organisations which compete against the private sector for the delivery of public services. That's a fairly major, what I can only call a paradigm shift. That isn't always recorded in all contributions on the topic, but that's what's happened. But it's had further consequences than that, because it means that most of the national third sector organisations, particularly in England, and I'm talking about Co-ops UK, I'm talking about Social Enterprise UK, are no longer really speaking for the organisations that really matter on the ground. They're in fact policy entrepreneurs, policy advocates, if you like, for that marketisation process that I've been trying to describe this afternoon. If you just want an example, Social Enterprise UK, which works pretty closely with the British Council, producing what they call mapping reports of countries literally around the globe, in 2019 produced a report on social enterprise in Jamaica, advocating the setup of a social stock exchange for the third sector in Jamaica. Now that really shows how far from what I would consider to be still the reality on the ground that Co-ops UK, and Co-ops UK, by the way, have now teamed up with the Employee Ownership Association in England, encouraging employees to buy shares in the companies where they work. Now that to me isn't industrial democracy. It certainly isn't the 7 principles of the International Cooperative Alliance, but that's how far Cooperatives UK, the Co-op Party and Social Enterprise UK in England have travelled. And I would certainly maintain that they are no longer in the main advocating the real arguments for co-ops and mutuals on the ground that need to be made. And a lot of us obviously are very concerned about that. If I can just go through the situation in Scotland, which as you can imagine is very, very different, very, very different, because the whole approach in Scotland has been bottoms up. Scott, the organisation of which I was a director until a couple of years ago, started informally in 1999 with a bulletin, the Scott Bulletin. We started off with 200 subscribers. Today we've got 4,500 subscribers. We've got 19 local place-based social enterprise networks. We've got 7 national in Scotland thematic networks. They deal with sport, culture and various national themes. All of those, as I say, have all been bottoms up and all been generated by the Social Enterprise Network Scotland itself. I'm going to skip over the next 3 slides very briefly because obviously I've got a fair amount to get through. In 2002, we'd established the Scott hub, if you like, at 54 Manor Place in Edinburgh. That then became the incubator for Scotland Unlimited, DTA Scotland, and a lot of organisations that I've listed there. But again, I think the most important thing to maintain is that most of the third sector organisations in Scotland emerged from that hub that Scott had created in 2002. So again, it's all bottoms up activity. And all of those organisations that I've listed on that slide grew from that hub. In 2004, we got enough funding from Scottish Government to establish the first local social enterprise network. Again, I'm doing some fast forward. By 2006, again, emanating from that hub in 2002 in Manor Place in Edinburgh, we'd set up the Scottish Community Alliance. The big step forward, and again, I'm doing some fast forward, so please excuse me. The big step is that by 2012, again, all voluntary, all bottoms up, not imposed by Scottish Government at all, we had promulgated what we thought in Scott was a voluntary code for what a social enterprise should be. Now, again, I've given you the link to the site, but if you simply Google Senscot code, you will see what I'm talking about. It's entirely up for social enterprises in Scotland voluntarily to sign up to that. We've got more than 1,100 organisations which have signed up to that. That code of practice and behaviour for social enterprises in Scotland now forms the basis of our social enterprise censi, our censuses in Scotland. And based on that, the censuses show that we've got 6,025 organisations in Scotland which we recognise as social enterprises. They are based on that code, because when the organisations in Scotland that did the census, they came to us as Senscot first, and they said, what do you reckon that we should be calling or styling a social enterprise? Again, I'm going to do some fast forward, and please forgive me because we can talk about the details later. The difficulty is that where we are now, when the Scottish Government published its latest version of the social enterprise strategy in 2016, a 10-year strategy which looks good, and launched its action plan. It launched an action plan in 2017. It's just launched another action plan. What Scottish Government has now decided to do is to say that they will only provide the funding for one national social enterprise organisation in Scotland. And that has literally put Senscot into direct competition with Social Enterprise Scotland. And Social Enterprise Scotland, to be candid with you, is a sort of Scottish version of Social Enterprise UK. They obviously promote a lot of the marketised stuff, a lot of the business-based stuff. So we're actually going to get, and the decision is supposed to be coming out this week from Scottish Government, because it's all been part of a procurement competition, would you believe? That's Senscot versus Social Enterprise Scotland. That's the community-based organisation versus the market-based organisation. That is supposed to be being decided by Scottish Government, we have been told, this week. I have to say that's obviously not the position in which we would like to be, but that's unfortunately where Scotland is at the moment. Scotland may decide to go down the route of England, or they may decide to stick with the much more community-based approach of Senscot. I'll talk about that a bit later, but you can see that things are now coming to a head. Despite all of the stuff that we as Senscot have done on the ground to make sure that the approach to social enterprise was community-based, it was based on the code, and the code, and I can talk about the principles in the code later, but the code says democratic accountability, no payment of external dividends to private shareholders. There are certain values to which social enterprises are supposed to adhere. All of that we've built up, and to be very candid with you, a lot of that is at stake in the Scottish Government's decision, the outcome from which we expect this Friday. Okay, again, I'm skipping through, and I do apologise, but we can come back to some of these slides and some of the detailed references later. It's a bit different in Wales, If you have a look on paper in Wales, have to say, and this is no ethnicity reflection at all, the Wales approach has been very different, because they have concentrated on a lot more top-down activity compared with the approach that we've taken in Scotland. If you go back as far as 2014, you had Paul Williams' Commission on Public Service Governance, suggesting, for example, alternative delivery mechanisms. You had the setting up of the Cooperative and Mutuals Commission in February 2014, produced a very wide-ranging series of recommendations on how third sector organisations ought to be prioritised. There was actually a piece of legislation in May 2014, the Social Services and Wellbeing Act, that says that all public authorities in procurement competitions have got an obligation to prioritise delivery by cooperative and mutual organisations. So that's actually in legislation for social services delivery in Wales. Another report in July 2015 is the Feeling Mutual. Again, another white paper on reforming local government and giving power to local people. resources which have been provided by all of that from the Care Council of Wales, and that's a pretty detailed set of resources that organisations bidding for public sector contracts from the third sector can avail themselves of. We've got a cooperative housing stakeholder group, we've got the Wales Council for Voluntary Action, we've got Social Business Wales, which gives business advice, we've got a Social Cooperation Forum for Wales, and we've got a Development Bank of Wales. Now, I have to say, if you put all of that together and construe that in terms of a public sector delivery setup or framework of which third sector organisations can avail themselves of the opportunities, that starts to look pretty comprehensive and pretty thorough. I think its main drawback, quite honestly, a lot of it is top down, and I've still got some doubts about the amount of activity on the ground that actually produces. The next slide, and again I'll flip through this, so I apologise. The Centre for Research on Social Cultural Change and the Foundational Economy Collective at the University of Manchester have produced a whole series of reports advocating more prominence and priority for the third sector in Wales. Again, some very significant stuff. I mean, this is not back of an old envelope research. So if you combine all of the Wales stuff together, unfortunately, as I say, a lot of it appears to me to be a bit top down, a lot already enshrined in legislation, in documents, public consultations, and research reports as well. But I have to say, how much activity on the ground that's actually produced, I've got some doubts. Okay, I've done England, I've done Scotland, I've done Wales. Now, if I may, just a few thoughts about Ireland. And again, I do need to stress to you, this is not me telling people in Ireland what to do. I would be politically dead against that anyway, I can assure you. If I have a look at the Irish Social Enterprise Network, which I suppose is one of the bigger, more prominent organisations for the promulgation of social enterprise in Ireland, I think what worries me a bit about that is that they are quite open about the fact that there's a lot of other organisations that they belong to, B Corps, Ashoka, etc. And a lot of those organisations, quite honestly, give priority to the market. If you have a look at the toolkit that they've produced, they talk about social enterprise regardless of what form the organisation takes. I get a bit concerned about that because very much that is the language of Social Enterprise UK. If you have a look at Social Enterprise Republic of Ireland, they then tend to talk about the same kind of approach, recognising that there's no specific legal company form for social enterprise, and talk about other organisations who can get into social enterprise type delivery. Again, if you have a look at the Social Entrepreneurs Network in Ireland, Social Enterprise Ireland, again, they talk about entrepreneurs or philanthropists looking to support social entrepreneurs. Again, this is mainly business-based stuff. If you have a look at the Social Finance Foundation, and obviously they've had funding and hopefully will continue to get funding from the Employment and Social Innovation Programme of the European Union. Again, most of this is based on a much more business-like approach. So, if I have a look at the main organisations purporting to represent social enterprise in Ireland, I've got the Irish Social Enterprise Network, I've got Social Enterprise Republic of Ireland, Social Entrepreneurs Ireland, Social Finance Foundation. Most of those are essentially tending towards a business approach, and certainly a lot of that approach would not be happy alongside what we've continued to advocate in Scotland as a much more community-based approach. But alongside that, of course, we've got the co-op movement. We've got ICOS, which is a very significant representative body of co-ops in Ireland. I recognise that most of those are agriculturally and rural based, but that's a big co-op base that Ireland has got. It's the same with Co-op Housing in Ireland, a very significant organisation working with local authorities, etc. But perhaps the sleeping giant, the biggest and most untold of all, is the Irish League of Credit Unions, 3.5 million members, 20 billion euros of assets, 5 billion euros of loans. These are significant organisations. The problem, and this is summed up in part by Patrick in his book, when he talks about cooperatives still playing an important part, although reduced in other roles. I think the problem that we now have is that some of the cooperative representative organisations in Ireland have still to make that transition into the wider co-op movement. We can talk about that a bit later. The Society of Cooperative Studies in Ireland, of which Patrick obviously plays a prominent part, I would hope that they would certainly be able to contemplate playing a higher profile role in awareness raising. So what have we got? And I've tried to summarise the potential, but let me not use my words. Let me use the words of Derek O'Brien and Gerard Doyle, good friends of mine, in a draft article that they've submitted to the Irish Journal of Management, and I hope that that will appear. And there are two main themes which emerge from their article about the generation and evolution and development of a national social enterprise and third sector strategy in Ireland. And I think this is very significant. First of all, what they have said, and it's obviously the case in England already, and unfortunately it's increasingly the case in Scotland, it's the social finance organisations that have dominated those consultations, and unfortunately the co-ops have been largely excluded. Now that's not my words, that's Derek and Gerard, who in many ways are far more entitled to talk about Ireland than I am. But again, if you have a look about what they talk about, and this sort of rings home to me because we've seen the same pressures in Scotland, we're talking about a gradual drift towards what we might call the Anglosphere and away from the European approach. I was talking before we started this seminar about Syriac with Andrew and Patrick. And the European, the continental, the mainstream European continental approach is very much based on a wider coverage of third sector organisations, which most of us would put together and call the social economy. The British approach, the English approach particularly, is based on a much more narrowly based set of organisations, much more based on impact investment, marketisation, participation in procurement competitions to deliver public services more cheaply. And unfortunately, it's that approach which is gaining credence and credibility and priority in the British-Irish Council. So I'll say no more except to say that you can see from the potential of the organisations which I've shown in Ireland and the comments which I've made, by the way, on Irish third sector organisations don't come from me. I've taken everything that I've said today about those organisations. I've taken what I've said about those organisations directly from their websites, not from me. But again, if you accept the interpretation of Derek and Gerard, the fact is that in the consultation which has taken place so far, it's the social finance organisations which have dominated, and the cooperative societies, the cooperative representation really has not played a very prominent part at all. Let me get towards winding up. I suppose the sort of shining light on the hill for many of us is the situation which obtains in Quebec. And if you have a look at the history of Quebec, obviously it's very much dominated by French thinking and European thinking. But in Quebec in 1999, evolving from the Women's March and various other developments, the Quebec provincial government set up and funded a Chantier de l'économie sociale, which is a social economy framework for the whole of Quebec, not just social enterprises, but for the whole of the social economy. That's what many of us would like to see. OK, we'll still fight for it in Scotland. I hope it's still possible in Ireland. I have to say I'm not so sure that we will get anywhere near that in England. But let me just draw this to a conclusion by saying this. Certainly from what is happening in England, and unfortunately, if the decision from Scottish Government on Friday goes in the wrong direction, it's the smaller civil society organisations who are doing the most important work in local communities, because certainly in COVID, it's those local community-based organisations that have literally kept the community going. Those are the organisations which will not benefit from loans and equity stakes and participation in the market. They aren't big enough to do that. What all of this is doing, you see, is destroying the local democracy and accountability, and there doesn't seem to be enough recognition in mainstream public discourse that all of this means that local community defence organisations are literally being abandoned and discarded to the market. And that enables us, and many of us are saying the same thing, that instead of the third sector and these organisations representing some kind of alternative to the market and capitalism, they are now part of capitalism themselves. A very good quote, which I frequently use, from Johnny Farley Gordon, who runs the Stir co-op promotional body in the southwest of England, down in Dorset. And Johnny, when he came to the opening of my book launch, said, well, what we're really confronting then is what you might call the end of third sector history, and all we're going to be left with is markets and the occasional act of kindness. I'm very much afraid that that's the direction in which we're heading. And this was a seminar organised in April 2019 by Gerard and the Society for Co-op Studies in Ireland, and a presentation and speech by Michael Taft from the Irish SIPTU Union, who basically said that democracy is the key. That democratic agenda, I think, is the cooperative's best agenda for taking root. Now, if we can get the cooperative movement to think a bit more about that, that's not just in Ireland, but in England and Wales and in Scotland. If we can get the trade unions to think a bit more about that, then, if I may say so, I think we've got a bit of hope. But without getting that discussion in some way back on the rails, without getting that discussion, well, again, returning it to public discourse, what's going to happen is more and more of the market, more and more public services that are not going to be delivered, and more public services which are going to be left behind. I'm just going to end, as I usually say to my students, there's 4 pages of references there. Most of them work because I've spent the past couple of days putting them in. And what I always try and do for my students, to save them reading the whole book, if I can find a convenient PDF or link that they can go to and read it in 5 or 10 minutes, that's what I've tried to do there. Andrew, Patrick, colleagues, I've probably said enough. Over to you. Thank you very much for listening. Questions, please.
Cheers. Thank you very much. It's very comprehensive and very interesting. Thank you. We have good 20 minutes at least for any questions or comments or thoughts that people have. You can either use the raise hand function, which for most people will be somewhere near the top right of the screen, or if you prefer, you can type into the chat box, and I'll try to keep an eye on that as well. So whenever you're ready. Patrick.
Thanks, Leslie, and thanks for a really stimulating conversation. And one of the things I always think about, actually, in terms of the development of the cooperative economy, is actually that it's a transnational operation. So I think actually we shouldn't be afraid of sharing insights and, you know, transgressing national borders, because I think that's actually something that's really important. But I just wondered if you could say something about, you've started the conversation with where New Labour comes into the social economy, and I kind of always approach these things historically, and I wondered whether you could say something specifically about maybe the decades before that, because when I first met you, it was actually at an event, I think in 2018 in Preston, where there's a very interesting experiment in local economic democracy taking place, and a quite successful one, I think, although you might have a different view on that. But there is something to be said, I think, for being, and actually, when I first met you, you had co-authored the Alternative Models of Ownership report for John McDonnell at the time, which is about doubling the size of the cooperative economy. But you pointed out to me that in the 1970s and 80s, that radical burst of activity had already taken place. And I just wondered if you could say something about what happened to that radical burst of activity that took place in the 70s.
Andrew, do you want me to answer question by question or do it in threes or what? I'll leave it to you.
I would answer that now. Yeah, please.
Okay. Patrick's absolutely right. I mean, if I may say so, University of Central Lancashire is one of the bright hopes, because what Julian and co have tried to do there is to widen the co-op framework and start to talk about things. And of course, they've got a link with Mondragon as well. So what they've started to talk about, if you like, is the wider co-op economy that I think we should be talking about, because that obviously enables me to go back to the 1970s and 1980s. As a result of the 1976 Industrial Common Ownership Act, and I was a minister in that government, by the way, and as a result of the 1978 Cooperative Development Agency Act, a lot of local cooperative development agencies sprung up across the whole of England. The Sheffield Co-op Development Group, of which I'm still a member and director, actually came during that period. So, as a sort of response to Thatcher, and largely because of the definition of a cooperative and funding that was made available, a lot of those local co-op development agencies literally doubled the size of the co-op economy. And if you have a look, I mean, during that period, depending on whose figures you take, we got something like 2,000 new worker-based cooperatives that were being formed. Now, I have to say, to be very, very candid with you, I'm not so sure that we've got the willpower or the infrastructure to carry that forward again. What John was suggesting in my book launch is that if we could get together some of the remnants of those organisations, and a lot of that is still around, like the Manor and Castle Development Trust in Sheffield, for example, a lot of those organisations from that period are still about. If we could link those, for example, with some of the student housing co-ops, with some of the community energy co-ops, with some of the other framework organisations which are about, I think we could get back to doubling the size of the co-op economy. The terrible thing is, though, that when I say to people that we've doubled the size of the co-op economy before, most people will say, oh yes, that's very interesting, I've read about that.
No, thanks. I mean, because you mentioned earlier I work for, well, I volunteer with the Society for Co-op Studies Ireland, and one of the big things that has come through to us and has been the numbers of community groups that have tried to start renewable co-op energy cooperatives, but have not been able to access the financing. But as you've pointed out in your talk there is a huge amount of cooperative finance that sits in the credit union sector, but there isn't a conduit between the two. Partly because of central bank regulation, I think, seems to be the main case. So it's there are actually the raw materials that exist in Ireland to kind of create that doubling effect, but it's just policy stops them from joining up. So it's kind of quite frustrating. But nevertheless, anyway, thanks.
Let me just say a very, very quick word on the co-op in co-ops in community energy, because this is very significant. When we had feed-in tariffs or the renewable heat incentive or a lot of the renewable heat incentives or renewables incentives around, that was when we had the biggest numbers of community energy co-ops. But unfortunately, the Co-op Party and Co-ops UK never made that argument. It was made by several European co-op organisations who said, look, if we can continue the feed-in tariffs and whatever incentives we've got, that enables smaller community-based organisations to survive. But unfortunately, they didn't make that argument. And this is what I mean about the Co-op Party and Co-ops UK particularly no longer being in a position to make the arguments which are most relevant to the co-op organisation and wider co-op movement.
I was wondering if I had a question about the contrast that you were drawing between Scotland and Wales, and I think probably I may have misunderstood, but I took it that you wanted to say that in Wales there's this more top-down approach, and that you thought that was a problem, and I wasn't really sure why. I was wondering if you could say a bit more just to explain the difference as you see it between the Welsh approach and Scottish approach, or at least the Scottish approach that you would prefer. and say what you think's gone wrong or going wrong in Wales.
Don't get me wrong. I mean, let me just share this with you. As part of John.
I think you've just gone silent.
That wasn't. Are we okay?
Yes.
Right. Okay. I'll try and make sure that doesn't happen again. When we went as part of John McDonnell's implementation group to gather evidence in Wales, to be honest with you, I was amazed at all of the great and good that turned up. There was Leighton Andrews, who was the minister. He brought with him his senior civil servants. There were the people on the Wales Mutuals and Co-op Commission 2014. I mean, if I may say so, all of the great and good of the co-op movement in Wales came along to that evidence gathering session as part of the implementation group. And I found that very impressive. I got talking to them afterwards. But I have to say, the actual stuff that came out of that for what we might do on the ground and how we might double the number of co-ops on the ground, because for me, it needs to be very much bottoms up. What came out of that session, despite all of the great and the good attending, I thought, not to be too insulting, was not very good, But I was genuinely amazed at the sort of hierarchy that turned up at that evidence gathering session. I mean, it was a difficult place to get to. It was a rugby ground in Newport, which was hellishly difficult to get to. But I mean, they all turned up, matter of course. But what actually emerged from it, I've got a few doubts. Our approach in Scotland, totally different. A lot of it was done by Lawrence DeMarco and Aidan Peer. We formed the hub in Manor Place. We invited like-minded organisations to come to the hub. We said, we don't want to have ownership of you. You go away and do your own thing. After that, a lot of the other infrastructure that was set up emerged from that hub, gradually got their own bits and pieces of European and Scottish government funding. That was topped off particularly when we published the code. And the code to us is very important in Scotland because it's our view of what a social enterprise should be. That was largely accepted by Scottish government. It's been used as the basis for the census. And as I say, the result of that is that if you have a look at the 4,500 readers of the bulletin that we've got every week, if you have a look at the fact that the census in 2019 identified 6,025 active social enterprises, if I may say so, for bottoms up activity, if I may say so, that's not too bad. So I'm not trying to run down anybody, but I'd like to say that our bottoms up approach has been a lot more rewarding than things that have happened in Wales. I'm being as impolite as I dare.
That's fine. Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions, comments?
I have another comment, if it's okay to come in. I was just wondering, Leslie, because obviously you have a background in Labour politics, and I'm thinking about this through the lens of Ireland, where there has never been a cooperative party. There's never been a political party that's tried to take ownership of what a cooperative policy agenda might look like. And I just wonder whether you think that is a good thing or a bad thing. I see Sinn Féin in the last few years have been making inroads into it. They've published policy position papers on worker co-ops. It remains to be seen how far they take that policy agenda. But I just whether more generally whether co-ops and politics should actually be formally separate, or whether you think there's an advantage in bringing the two together.
I've got a thanks, Patrick. I've got a piece which hopefully will appear in Tribune shortly. The problem that we've got with the co-op party is that unfortunately it's degenerated almost in, I have to be careful what I say, it's almost degenerated into the Fabian Society. Now the Fabian Society, okay, mostly Guardian readers, lovely people, fairly middle class in their outlook, but in terms of making much political headway in the Labour Party, even in the Labour Party that we have today, not very optimistic. The co-op party is even worse in that the structure of the co-op party that we have at the moment doesn't even permit the affiliation of worker co-ops, community benefit societies, community energy co-ops. It's exactly the same argument that we went through with the co-op party in the 1980s. I can well remember going to a co-op party conference in Ayr, I think it was about 1986, where we tried to get the co-op party to accept the affiliation of worker co-ops. They didn't want to know. It's exactly the same as we've got now, although the more active parts of the co-op movement, and I'm talking about community benefit societies, community energy, student housing, a lot of the organisations which are on the ground ought to be enabled to affiliate directly or as affiliates, as they can do in the Labour Party, to the co-op party. That isn't permissible. It's worse than that. It's worse than that because the co-op party doesn't have well, obviously it doesn't have anything like momentum. It doesn't have anything like the world transformed and all of the fringe organisations which the Labour Party has. Now, I'm not saying that all of the ideas which are put forward by those fringe organisations automatically get adopted, but at least that enables that kind of discussion to take place. And hopefully some of those initially fringe concepts and ideas eventually get to become mainstream party policy. There is no equivalent of that process in the co-op party at all. I think it's very sad, for example. Let me just give you one tiny example. To me, one of the most interesting developments that we've now got, and this is probably going to appear to be a bit anorak, the companies that supply schools and academies with teachers, supply teacher agencies, are dominated by the private sector. If you're a supply teacher and you work for one of these supply agencies, they will take getting on for 40% of your money. In other words, you may be a properly qualified teacher, you may not want a full-time job, you've got to go to one of these agencies who will take 40% of your money. We've now got the possibility of cooperatives being set up that will look after supply teachers. Now, that hasn't come from the co-op party, hasn't come from Co-ops UK, it's actually come from the leader of North Tyneside Council. So you see, there's a whole lot of stuff, quite honestly, that ought to be being advocated and argued for by the co-op party and by Co-ops UK. But unfortunately, since they've moved so far into the market, they've pretty well given up on making those kinds of arguments.
So following that through, that do you think then that within Ireland, it's very much a case that if there is kind of any hope that it's kind of good that the co-ops themselves remain unaffiliated to any political facing organisation?
I'm not so sure that the affiliation is the thing. What you need to have is your ability to get within the policy parameters of those organisations. Now, that may be by going along to their conferences and holding fringe meetings. It may be by affiliating in some way to those organisations. But I would have thought, first of all, by having a few more think tanks and feed-in mechanisms, fringe meetings at conferences, and if not direct, then indirect affiliations to those organisations. That's the way that you do it. I mean, that's the way that organisations got into the Labour Party. I mean, when I was on the Labour Party National Executive Committee and I was the chair of a worker co-ops group in 1980, would you believe, we actually recommended then a Macora law. In other words, that workers should be allowed to set up co-ops with some funding from the state. We actually recommended that in 1980. It was actually in the 1983 Labour Party manifesto. But most of that didn't come from me, didn't come from the Labour Party National Executive Committee. It came from the people that we took evidence from. So there's all sorts of ways of feeding into the mainstream political discourse. I mean, the Dáil, for example, holds hearings. If I may say so, being blunt about it, you can stimulate a lot of those hearings. You can stimulate a lot of those hearings. you can actually encourage committees and subcommittees and whatever in the Dáil to hold hearings. And okay, you can turn, I shouldn't be saying this, you can turn up and dominate those hearings. There's all sorts of ways in which co-op organisations can get themselves onto the agenda. I'm being too political with the small p.
That's good. That's good. Thanks.
Well, on that strategic note, we might think about calling this to a close. So, let me first of all thank Leslie for a really interesting and stimulating presentation and some really interesting discussion. Thank you very much for that. And I encourage you all to go out and get his book.